The blood-red sun sank beneath the distant mesas as Elizabeth Grayson clutched the doctor's letter, her fingers trembling so violently that the paper crackled in the still evening air. The word leapt from the page like a brand upon her soul, Barren, a single word that shattered every dream she'd carefully nurtured since girlhood. It was 1878 in Silvercliff, Colorado, a mining town that had sprouted between mountain ridges like a determined weed. Elizabeth had arrived 3 years prior as a mail-order bride, only to find her intended groom had died of typhoid 2 weeks before her arrival. Stranded without funds to return east, she'd made her own way, establishing a small bakery that served the miners, cowboys, and townsfolk with equal measures of sweetness and dignity. Now at 26, Elizabeth stood on the edge of her small vegetable garden, watching as the last light bled from the sky. The doctor's verdict explained the years of disappointment, the monthly heartbreak, the whispers among the town's matrons. She'd consulted Dr. Palmer in Denver during her supply trip, unable to bear the thought of the town knowing her shame. "Miss Grayson?" The deep voice startled her from her thoughts. "Begging your pardon, but your shop door was open. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Elizabeth hurriedly stuffed the letter into her apron pocket and turned to find Matthew Northrop, one of the cowboys from the Diamond D Ranch, standing at the corner of her house. The fading light caught the angles of his face, shadowed beneath his worn hat. "Mr. Northrop." Elizabeth straightened her shoulders and cleared her throat. "Just getting some evening air. Was there something you needed?" Matthew shifted his weight, hat in hand. At 32, he was considered one of the more reliable men who worked for Douglas Diamond, not prone to drunkenness or brawling like many of the younger hands. "Just passing through town on my way back to the ranch. Thought I might get one of those honey cakes before you closed up shop." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for the distraction. "Of course. Please come in." The small bakery smelled of cinnamon and sugar, a comforting contrast to the dust and leather scent Matthew brought with him. Elizabeth moved behind the counter, her practiced hands selecting one of the golden cakes from beneath a cloth cover. "How are things at the Diamond D?" she asked, wrapping the cake in paper.
"Busy.
Getting ready for the cattle drive to Denver next month." Matthew placed a few coins on the counter. "Mr. Diamond's got his eye on some new breeding stock. Says it'll change the whole future of the ranch." The word breeding lanced through Elizabeth like a physical pain. Her hand faltered, and the neatly wrapped package tumbled to the floor. "I'm sorry," she murmured, bending to retrieve it just as Matthew did the same. Their heads knocked gently, and Elizabeth pulled back, mortified to find tears springing to her eyes from the combination of physical and emotional pain. "Miss Grayson?" Matthew's voice softened with concern. "Are you hurt?" "No, Elizabeth turned away, busying herself with retrieving a fresh cloth to rewrap the cake. "Just clumsy today, it seems." Matthew straightened, studying her with careful eyes. "Something's troubling you." It wasn't a question, and the simple observation broke something in Elizabeth's carefully constructed composure. A single tear escaped, tracking down her cheek before she could catch it. "It's nothing that concerns others," she said firmly, handing him the newly wrapped cake. "Please enjoy your evening, Mr. Northrop." Matthew accepted the package, but made no move to leave. "Sometimes talking helps, Miss Grayson. Even to a rough cowboy like me." Elizabeth felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. How could she possibly explain to this man that her very womanhood was deficient? That she'd just learned she could never have children? That the dreams she'd harbored of a family of her own were as barren as her womb? "I appreciate your concern, but this is a private matter." Matthew nodded slowly. "Fair enough. But if you need anything at all, the Diamond D isn't far." After he left, Elizabeth locked the shop door and retreated to her small room behind the bakery. She removed the doctor's letter from her pocket and stared at it once more before casting it into the small fire in her stove. As the paper curled and blackened, Elizabeth made a decision. There would be no more tears. No more dreams of what could never be. She would build her life around what she had: her bakery, her independence, and lock away the longing for anything more. The following weeks passed in a blur of work and forced smiles. Elizabeth rose before dawn to prepare her breads and pastries, served her customers with polite detachment, and fell into exhausted sleep each night. If the townspeople noticed a change in the normally warm baker, they didn't mention it to her face, though the whispers continued. It was a Thursday morning when Matthew Northrop returned to the bakery. Elizabeth was pulling a tray of biscuits from the oven when the bell above the door jingled. "Be with you in a moment," she called without looking up. "No hurry, Miss Grayson." Elizabeth's head snapped up at the familiar voice. Matthew stood just inside the door, hat in hand, looking somewhat cleaner than usual. His dark hair was still damp from washing, and he'd clearly made an effort with his appearance. "Mr. Northrop, what brings you to town today?" Matthew approached the counter. "Mr. Diamond sent me to arrange supplies for the drive, and I had a hankering for one of your cinnamon rolls." Elizabeth selected the largest roll from her display case and wrapped it carefully. "Will that be all?" "Actually," Matthew cleared his throat, "I was wondering if you might consider a proposal." Elizabeth froze, her eyes widening. "Not that kind of proposal," Matthew added hastily, his ears reddening beneath his tan. "A business arrangement. We'll have 20 men on this drive, and Mr. Diamond's looking for someone to handle the cooking. Our usual cook broke his leg last week. The pay's good, and you'd be back before winter sets in." Elizabeth blinked in surprise. "You want me to cook for a cattle drive? That's hardly appropriate, Mr. Northrop." "There'd be no impropriety," Matthew assured her quickly. "You'd have your own wagon, and the men know better than to step out of line with Mr. Diamond's rules. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "most of them are more afraid of your rolling pin than any gun." Despite herself, Elizabeth felt a small smile tug at her lips. "I've never been on a cattle drive." "It's hard work," Matthew admitted, "but the country you'll see. It's something special, Miss Grayson. Might do you good to get away from town for a spell." The thought of escaping the pitying glances and whispers was tempting, and closing the bakery for a few weeks wouldn't hurt. Most of her regular customers would understand. "When would you leave?" she asked carefully. "Monday next. Give you time to arrange things here." Elizabeth considered for a moment longer. "I'll think on it, Mr. Northrop." Matthew nodded, seeming pleased even with this non-commitment. "That's all I ask. Mr. Diamond says to let him know by Saturday." After he left, Elizabeth found herself genuinely contemplating the offer. What did she have to stay for? The bakery would wait, and perhaps some time away would help her come to terms with her new reality. By Saturday, her decision was made. Elizabeth walked to the Diamond D Ranch and informed Mr. Diamond himself that she would accept the position. The older man, with his silver-streaked beard and shrewd eyes, seemed pleased. "Matthew spoke highly of your character, Miss Grayson. We'll treat you with respect, and you'll be well compensated for your efforts." The preparations consumed Elizabeth's next few days. She arranged for Mrs. Peterson, the blacksmith's wife, to check on her house and bakery. She packed practical clothing, her best knives and cooking utensils, and enough personal items to last the journey. By Monday morning, when Matthew arrived with the supply wagon, Elizabeth was waiting, her face set with determination. "Ready for an adventure, Miss Grayson?" Matthew asked, helping her onto the wagon seat. "As ready as I'll ever be, Mr. Northrop." The cattle drive began at dawn the following day. Elizabeth had spent the night at the ranch house, hosted by Mrs. Diamond, who provided her with a list of the men's names and a few warnings about particular appetites and dislikes. "They're good men, mostly," Mrs. Diamond had said, "but they work hard and expect to eat well. Don't let them intimidate you." Now, as Elizabeth worked in the chuck wagon, preparing breakfast for 20 hungry cowboys, she felt a strange sense of purpose. The open sky stretched endlessly above her, the vast grasslands rolling to the horizon. It was beautiful in its wildness, so different from the confined spaces of her bakery and the close-set buildings of town. Need any help? Matthew appeared beside the wagon, his presence becoming a familiar comfort over the past days of preparation. I believe I have things under control, Elizabeth replied, flipping bacon in a large cast-iron skillet. Though I wouldn't say no to more firewood. Matthew nodded and set about collecting more fuel for her cooking fire. Elizabeth watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the easy way he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. Unlike some of the younger cowboys who seemed intent on proving themselves constantly, Matthew had a settled quality about him. The first week on the trail passed in a blur of dust, endless work, and surprising contentment. Elizabeth rose before the men each day, preparing coffee and breakfast by firelight. The days were filled with the rhythms of the drive, the moving cattle, the shifting campsite, the preparation of meals that needed to be both filling and possible to make under primitive conditions. It was during the second week that disaster struck. They'd been warned about the possibility of storms this time of year, but nothing had prepared Elizabeth for the violence of the thunderstorm that rolled across the plains. The sky darkened to an ominous green-black, and the air grew heavy with electricity. "Get to the wagon," Matthew shouted over the rising wind, appearing suddenly at Elizabeth's side as she struggled to secure her cooking equipment. Storms coming fast. The first drops were falling as Matthew helped Elizabeth into the chuck wagon. He secured the canvas covering just as the heavens opened, rain pounding against the fabric like stones. "Will the cattle be all right?" Elizabeth asked, raising her voice over the storm's fury. "The boys are keeping them together," Matthew replied, water streaming from his hat brim. "But I'd better help. Stay here where it's safe." Before Elizabeth could protest, he was gone, disappearing into the curtain of rain. The storm raged for hours, lightning splitting the sky with blinding flashes, thunder shaking the very ground beneath the wagon. Elizabeth huddled beneath a blanket, praying for the safety of the men and, she admitted to herself, especially for Matthew. When the storm finally passed, the damage was evident. Several cattle had been lost, equipment scattered, and 2 men injured. Elizabeth immediately set about making hot coffee and food for the exhausted cowboys. "Anyone seen Matthew?" she asked Mr. Diamond when he came for coffee. The rancher's face grew grim. He was helping young Jenkins with some strays that were heading for the ravine. Jenkins came back, but there's no sign of Matthew or his horse. Elizabeth felt her heart constrict. "You're sending out search parties?" "Already done. Don't you worry, Miss Grayson. Matthew knows this country better than most. If anyone can find his way back, it's him." But as the day wore on with no sign of the missing cowboy, Elizabeth found herself watching the horizon constantly. When darkness fell and the search parties returned empty-handed, she couldn't sleep, instead sitting by the dying campfire long after the others had retired. "You should rest," Mr. Diamond said gently, joining her by the fire. "We'll resume the search at first light." "I can't help thinking about him out there alone," Elizabeth admitted. "He's been nothing but kind to me." The older man studied her face in the firelight. "Matthew's a good man. One of my best. And he thinks highly of you, Miss Grayson." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. "We're barely acquaintances, Mr. Diamond. Sometimes that's all it takes to recognize quality in another person." He stood, patting her shoulder. "Try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." Morning brought no news, and the drive had to continue. Mr. Diamond left 2 men behind to search, with instructions to catch up when they could. Elizabeth threw herself into her work, trying not to think of Matthew injured or worse. It was late afternoon when the shout went up. Elizabeth looked up from her preparations for the evening meal to see a rider approaching from the east, a single figure slumped in the saddle of an exhausted horse. "It's Matthew," someone called, and Elizabeth dropped her spoon, heedless of the stew splashing her skirt. The men gathered around as Matthew's horse plodded into camp. He looked terrible, his clothing torn, a bloody gash across his forehead, his face gray with exhaustion. But he was alive. Mr. Diamond and 2 other cowboys helped him from the saddle. "Get him to the chuck wagon," the rancher ordered. "Miss Grayson, can you tend to him while I send someone for his horse?" Elizabeth nodded, already clearing a space in the wagon. The men carried Matthew over and laid him on the bedroll Elizabeth hastily spread out. "Water," Matthew croaked when the others had gone. Elizabeth knelt beside him, lifting his head gently to help him drink. "What happened?" "Horse spooked at the lightning," he murmured. "Threw me down the ravine. Took me all night to climb out, and all day to find the trail." "You're injured." Elizabeth dampened a cloth and began cleaning the wound on his forehead. Matthew winced, but didn't pull away. "Nothing broken, I don't think. Just banged up pretty good." Elizabeth worked in silence, cleaning his wounds and applying salve from her small medical kit. His breathing steadied as she worked, and some color returned to his face. "Thought I might not make it back," he admitted quietly. "Kept thinking about things left undone. Words unsaid." Elizabeth's hands stilled. "You're safe now. That's what matters." Matthew caught her wrist gently. "When you're facing what might be your end, Miss Grayson, you get mighty clear about what's important." His eyes, despite his exhaustion, were intent on her face. "And I realized the thing I regretted most was not telling you how much I've come to admire you." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. "Mr. Northrop, you're exhausted and injured. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying, Elizabeth." His use of her first name sent a small shock through her. "I've watched you these past weeks. Your strength, your kindness, the way you face each day's challenges without complaint. I'd be honored if you'd consider allowing me to court you properly when we return." Elizabeth pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "You don't know what you're asking." Matthew struggled to sit up. "I'm asking for a chance to know you better. Nothing more." "You deserve more than I can give," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A man like you should have a family. Children." The word lodged in her throat. Understanding dawned in Matthew's eyes. "Is that what's been troubling you? Since that day in your bakery?" Elizabeth turned away, busying herself with reorganizing her medical supplies. "Please rest, Mr. Northrop. You need to regain your strength." But Matthew wasn't deterred. "Elizabeth, look at me." The quiet authority in his voice compelled her to face him. Matthew had managed to sit up fully, despite his obvious pain. "Whatever you're carrying, whatever burden you think makes you unworthy, I'd like the chance to prove it doesn't matter to me." Elizabeth felt the walls she'd carefully constructed beginning to crumble. "You don't understand. Then help me understand." The simple request, offered without judgment, broke the dam of her resistance. The words came tumbling out, the doctor's verdict, the dreams she'd had to abandon, the hollow feeling that had taken root inside her. "I cannot bear children," she finally said, the admission like glass in her throat. "I am barren." She spat the word as if it were poison. "No man wants a wife who cannot give him children, Mr. Northrop. Especially not out here, where family means survival." Matthew was quiet for so long that Elizabeth became certain she'd proven her point. She turned to leave the wagon, needing escape from his silence, when his voice stopped her. "My sister had 5 children," he said softly. 5 births in 7 years. The last one killed her. Elizabeth turned back, startled by this revelation. "She was 19, Matthew continued. Barely more than a child herself. Her husband remarried, within the year needed someone to care for all those babies." His eyes held Elizabeth's. "I watched him court the new woman, talking about all the additional children they'd have. Never once mentioned my sister's name again, as if she'd been nothing more than a breeding mare that had served her purpose." Elizabeth sank back down beside him. "I'm so sorry." "My point," Matthew said gently, "is that there's more to a woman's worth than her ability to bear children. more to marriage than producing heirs. He reached for her hand. You're alive, Elizabeth. You're here, breathing, thinking, feeling. That's all I've ever asked of anyone I might love, just to be alive alongside me in this hard, beautiful world. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. It's not that simple. Maybe it is, Matthew countered. Maybe we make things harder than they need to be. The drive continued for another 3 weeks. Matthew recovered gradually, returning to his duties while Elizabeth maintained her role as cook. Something had shifted between them after their conversation in the wagon, a tentative understanding, a careful consideration of possibilities neither had previously allowed themselves to contemplate. They spoke often during the evening hours after the day's work was done. Elizabeth learned about Matthew's childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, his dreams of someday having land of his own. She shared stories of her life back east, her adjustment to frontier life, her determination to make her own way. Have you ever thought about children who need homes? Matthew asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the rest of the camp having turned in for the night. Elizabeth glanced at him. What do you mean? There's no shortage of orphans out here, Matthew said. Disease, accidents, Indian conflicts, children who have no one. My foreman and his wife took in 3 children from a wagon train where the parents died of cholera. Elizabeth had never considered this possibility. You think people would accept that? A family made that way? Some wouldn't, Matthew acknowledged, but the ones who matter would. The idea took root in Elizabeth's mind, growing alongside her deepening feelings for the quiet, thoughtful cowboy. When they finally reached Denver and delivered the cattle, Elizabeth felt a strange reluctance to return to Silvercliff. The weeks on the trail had changed her, or perhaps they had simply revealed a strength she hadn't known she possessed. What will you do now? Matthew asked as he helped her load her belongings into the wagon that would take them back to the Diamond D and eventually to town. Return to my bakery, I suppose, Elizabeth replied. And you? Matthew glanced at the bustling city around them. Mr. Diamond has offered me a position as his foreman. Jenkins is retiring come spring. That's wonderful news. Elizabeth tried to sound genuinely pleased, though the thought of Matthew remaining at the ranch while she returned to town created an unexpected ache. It comes with the use of the old Mackenzie place, Matthew continued. It needs work, but it's good land. Room for a garden. Maybe some chickens. Elizabeth nodded, not trusting herself to speak. It's too much house for one person, Matthew added, his voice carefully casual. 2 rooms downstairs, 3 up. One of them might make a fine nursery someday, for whatever children might need a home. Elizabeth's hands stilled on her luggage. Mr. Northrop, Matthew, he corrected gently. After all we've been through, I think we're past formalities, don't you? Elizabeth met his eyes. Matthew, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you, Elizabeth Grayson, he said simply. I'm saying I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife. Not for what your body can or cannot do, but for who you are, the woman I've come to admire and cherish these past weeks. Elizabeth felt tears well in her eyes. But your dreams of a family can still come true, Matthew finished for her. Just not in the way we might have originally thought. He took her hands in his. Family isn't just about blood, Elizabeth. It's about love and choice and commitment. In that moment, standing amidst the bustle of Denver's stockyards, Elizabeth saw a future opening before her different from the one she'd mourned, but perhaps even more beautiful for being unexpected. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, Matthew. Their wedding took place the following spring, a simple ceremony in the Silvercliff church. Elizabeth sold her bakery to Mrs. Peterson's daughter, who had shown a talent for baking, though Elizabeth continued to help with special orders and teaching the younger woman her recipes. The old Mackenzie place bloomed under their care. Vegetable gardens replaced weeds, fresh paint brightened weathered clapboards, and the sound of laughter filled rooms that had stood empty for years. Matthew proved to be a skilled foreman, earning the respect of the ranch hands and the trust of Mr. Diamond. It was a year into their marriage when the opportunity arose. The stagecoach had been attacked by bandits 15 miles outside of town. The driver and guard had survived, as had a young woman passenger, but her husband had been killed, leaving her alone with twin 3-year-old girls and an infant boy. "They're at Doc Wilson's now," Matthew told Elizabeth when he returned from town with the news. "The mother's not expected to survive the night. Bullet wounds gone bad." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "We should go to them." By morning, the young mother had passed, and 3 frightened children huddled together on Doc Wilson's examining table, the oldest girls trying valiantly to comfort their wailing baby brother. "What will happen to them?" Elizabeth asked the doctor quietly. "Orphanage in Denver, most likely," he replied. "Unless someone local steps forward." Elizabeth looked at Matthew, a question in her eyes. He nodded, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "We have room," Elizabeth told the doctor. "If the authorities permit it, we'd like to take them in." There were papers to sign, questions to answer, but within a week, the children were installed at the ranch. The adjustment wasn't easy. Nightmares plagued the twins, and the baby seemed inconsolable at times, but gradually, a rhythm emerged. Elizabeth discovered a capacity for love she hadn't known existed. The twins, Emma and Ellie, blossomed under her care, their initial wariness giving way to trust. Little Michael, not yet a year old, began to reach for her rather than pull away. "You're a natural mother," Matthew told her one evening as they watched the children playing on a quilt in the yard. Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd have this." "Nor I," Matthew admitted. "After seeing what happened to my sister, I wasn't sure I wanted a family." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But this feels right." Over the years, 3 more children found their way to the Northrop home: a boy whose parents died in a fire, a girl abandoned by a mother who couldn't feed her, and another boy found wandering alone after an Indian attack on a homestead. Each child brought new challenges and new joys, until the house that had once seemed too large for one person barely contained the happy chaos of their family. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Elizabeth and Matthew sat on the porch swing, watching their brood chase fireflies in the deepening twilight. "Any regrets?" Matthew asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. Elizabeth considered the question, thinking back to the woman she had been standing in her garden, clutching a doctor's letter that declared her less than whole. How far she had come from that moment of despair. "Not one," she replied, turning to press a kiss to her husband's weathered cheek. "You gave me a family more beautiful than any I could have dreamed." Matthew smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening with genuine happiness. "We gave it to each other, my love. And to them." He nodded toward the children, now counting their captured fireflies with excited voices. As darkness settled fully over their home, Elizabeth reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. The word that had once seemed like a sentence to a half-lived life, Barren, had lost its power. In its place stood this, a love that saw beyond limitations, a family created by choice rather than chance, and a life richer than she could have imagined. "Come inside, children," she called, rising from the swing. "Time for stories before bed." As they gathered their laughing, protesting brood and herded them toward the house, Elizabeth caught Matthew's eye over the children's heads. The look they shared held a decade of understanding, of challenges overcome, of love that had only deepened with time. She was alive. They were all alive. And that had indeed been enough to build something beautiful in this hard, wild country they called home.